we'll see if anybody else logs in here in the next few minutes, but we're going to focus on the Reconstruction. Now, last week we talked about the civil rights movement a little bit. Talked about what was that group of kids called? Oh, the Little Rock Nine, right?
Yes.
So the Little Rock Nine to integrate Central High School in Little Rock, Arkansas. What year was that? 1957. So that was the civil rights movement in the 1950s and 60s. We're going to backtrack 100 years from there. And I found this article from Black History Month in February, but it's still true. This year is the 150th anniversary of the 15th Amendment. So we're going to talk about the Reconstruction. This article is written from a certain perspective. It's not just like a straight nonfiction article. It's written by a teacher, and she talks in the first person. Um, but there's a lot of really good information. It's a good overview of the Reconstruction. It doesn't get very specific, but it gives a lot of different topics related to it. Um, so let's look at my timeline here. So U.S. history, where this is going to fall, I added a new one here, this green. The 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments are the Reconstruction Amendments, and they were ratified. 1865 was the 13th Amendment, and then the third one, the 15th Amendment, was 1870. So you call them, they're a group. They didn't pass as a group, they passed individually. But together you call those three things the Reconstruction Amendments. So this is after the Civil War. The North wins the Civil War, the South loses. So what's the first thing they need to do? What does the 13th Amendment do you think?
They need a budget to go ahead and lay out some new ground rules after being able to work things out.
Well, yeah, that whole period is called Reconstruction. I think they even called it Reconstruction then. Like that's what they considered their job to do. So they're reconstructing the country. They gotta piece these two torn apart sections of the country back together. They got to stitch the country back together. But in regards to the question of slavery, the three Reconstruction Amendments do things, and they it kind of has to happen in this order, right? So the first thing, the 13th Amendment, you have to officially end slavery. So the 13th Amendment ends slavery right after the Civil War. Actually, I think it was passed. I should say I should know this. Actually, I just had a Wikipedia page. Let me look this up real quick. I was just looking at it because I'm wondering if I was going to say it passed during the Civil War, but that could be. It was passed in the Senate April 8th, 1864. Um, Passed the House of Representatives January 31st, 1865. So that is during the Civil War, but that's passed, but that's not ratified. It has to go be ratified by the states. That happens on December 6th, 1865. So it was in the process. It was moving through the process during the last year of the Civil War, the 13th Amendment. So that ends slavery. The 14th Amendment um, is to declare regardless of race, and of course they have in mind the black people formerly enslaved Africans and African Americans, but all races, anybody regardless of race, it becomes a citizen. Now it's 1860 whatever, and so everybody doesn't mean everybody. Everybody means men, but regardless of race, men become citizens. Okay. Then the third thing that you got to do to finish this process out. Okay, you've ended slavery. You've made black men citizens. What's the third thing you got to do here? What's the 15th Amendment do? What should citizens have the right to do?
Vote?
Vote. So the 15th Amendment gives all citizens the right to vote. Okay. And Nadia, Carla, thank you for logging in. Hope you're doing.
Good morning. I'm sorry for being late today.
Oh, it's okay.
I just, yeah, I just finished my job right now.
Yeah, okay, no problem. We're getting ready to start reading about the Reconstruction period after the Civil War. So the Reconstruction Amendments, the 13th, 14th, 15th Amendments happen very quickly after the Civil War. And they free the slaves, make them citizens, and give them the right to vote. Okay. Think, as much as our world has changed even in the last month, this is certainly crazy for us, but there have been much crazier times in American history, and I would argue right after the Civil War. I mean, there's a lot you could think of lots of times, but this is a period that's really interesting to me because, like, just think of the rapid changes that are happening to the foundation of society, especially if you're in the South. Okay, maybe you used to be a slave owner, maybe you used to be a slave, and now you're not either of those things. And so you got to find a way to make a living, no matter who you are. Um, well, a big thing we're going to look at, and a big thing in the Reconstruction is um, they're integrating the South back into the country, right? The purpose of the Civil War was that the South wanted to secede, to become its own country. They failed. They lost the war. Well, now we gotta all be friends again, and so they are stitching together the broken pieces of this country. They gotta have governments again, national government, state governments, local governments. So one thing that happens in Reconstruction is that a big number, especially at the local level, a big number of former slaves are elected to positions, to the United States Senate, to statewide governorships, and certainly to local and city offices too. So people who just a second ago were slaves are now helping to run the country or run your town or run your state. Now, the big picture is, spoiler alert, Reconstruction is a specific period because that super fast progress took, it was almost one step forward, two steps back, because over that period, on my timeline here, I have Reconstruction 1865 to 1877. It's not even, that's only 12 years. That's not even a decade and a half. It's pretty much only a decade. You have white supremacy groups and people who feel very threatened by the progress that the African American population, the black population, is making. They, for whatever reason, don't like that direction that society's going in, and so they start pushing back. You have the birth of the Ku Klux Klan. And so by 1777, we call that the end of the Reconstruction, a lot of that progress was erased. Now, the Reconstruction Amendments are still law. You can't undo them, although you could if you really tried. Just like in Prohibition in the 1920s, they reversed that. But it'd be crazy, they're not undoing the Reconstruction Amendments. So the laws don't change, the constitutional laws don't change, but society, even though it looked like it was going to be overnight much different, much safer, and what I think we would all agree is much happier and more peaceful, that peace and harmony disappeared pretty quickly because people saw it happening, didn't like it, pushed back against it. And so, unfortunately, Reconstruction is a specific period in history, and then you enter into a long period where, it's 100 more years before you have the Civil Rights Act of 1964. It's another 100 years. So we fight the Civil War, free the slaves, make them citizens, give them the vote, and then it's another almost 100 years before that story plays out, and it's still playing out today. We're not a perfect country now. So let's jump into the reading. Okay, and again, this is, it doesn't zoom in specifically on a topic. It kind of breezes through a lot of different things. And in the future, maybe we could zoom in on some specific things. But this is kind of an overview, gives you just a lot of things to think about Reconstruction. Okay, most younger kids, say a fifth grader, know about the Civil War, right? And even some high school, I hope every high schooler knows about the Civil War. But the Reconstruction, I don't know if teachers don't get to it, or they don't think it's as interesting, or maybe we all learned it but we just forget it because it isn't as interesting. But I think if you look at society, some people think history is all about wars and presidents, right? But if you get away from looking at history in that vein, then history, I think, when you look at is most interesting when you look at the lives of regular people. And the Reconstruction is the story of the lives of regular people. So I think it's pretty interesting. The country was changing very rapidly. So there's a few sections here. Let's preview our sections. We got an introduction. We've got a section on voting rights, politics and activism, educational experience of Black Americans, and a limited freedom is how it ends. Okay, so let's take turns reading. I'll read a chunk of the introduction here. Now this is written just in February for Black History Month this year, so it's a current article. Now this is a famous picture. If you look up, just Google Reconstruction, this says it's a 1872 portrait of Black Americans serving in Congress, in the United States Congress. And these are some, if you're into African American history or this time period, these are some pretty famous guys. Hiram Revels is the first Black man elected to the Senate, and there's some representatives. So, people who were just a second ago, it seems, slaves, are being elected to run the country. Okay, anyway. It says, once I asked a middle school social studies class what they knew about Black history. I'll never forget the response of one student who said, Martin Luther King freed the slaves. Of course, there's 100 years between those two things. Martin Luther King Jr. was born in 1929, more than 60 years after slavery had already ended. To me, this comment demonstrated how closely Americans associate Black history with slavery. The student's answer shocked me, but I knew their incorrect answer had to do with the fact that schools spend very, very little time teaching Black history. Most adults don't know much about Black history either. For instance, what do you know about Reconstruction? I'm excited about using the New York Times 1619 project to teach more about the history of slavery. However, I also believe that understanding what happened during Reconstruction is important for understanding the power and excellence of Black Americans. Okay, and I think that sentence right there is kind of the thesis. Okay, I also believe that understanding what happened during Reconstruction is important for understanding the power and excellence of Black Americans. So this is going to be an article about Reconstruction, not slavery, because this author wants you to understand those are two separate things. Slavery doesn't, or Black history doesn't always mean slavery. There's other parts to it. So he says, even though she's excited to use the 1619 project to teach about slavery, there's, she wants to teach about other things. Now, the 1619 project came out this year. No, wait, it was the end of last year, middle of last year. It was the New York Times 1619 project. It's a bunch of videos and articles and all kinds of stuff, and they were using it in schools and stuff. But if you Google it, it's there. There's a lot of information. 1619, I think we've touched on it. I've mentioned it in the past. What happened in the year 1619? Anybody know?
I don't remember.
Well, it's a study
I
of slavery.
remember.
The 1619 project is a study of slavery.
1619 was the year that the first Africans landed on the shores of America.
Yeah, yeah, as slaves, right? So 1619, let's think, Jamestown, Virginia. You have English people landing in Jamestown, creating Jamestown, Virginia, I think 1608. Okay. Now, of course, people have known about North America, this land. For before that, you have Christopher Columbus in 1492. You have other people exploring. You have even the Vikings came over 1,000 years ago, even before that. But really, the beginning of European living in this in what's now our country really starts with Jamestown in Virginia in 1608. The Pilgrims land in Massachusetts in 1620. Okay, in 1619, people coming and going from Jamestown, Virginia. It's a very small town, but they had ships coming and going. They were trying to, I think, grow tobacco in order to make money. It was a British colony. They bring over on a ship in 1619, on a ship called the White Lion, was the name of the ship. The White Lion lands, and off come 20, I think either 19 or 20 Africans who had been captured and turned into slaves. So the 1619 project is about slavery. And if you're interested, it's a New York Times 1619 project. They go back to the very start of slavery. So last year, 2019, was the 400th anniversary of, and I suppose they know the date of that ship. But at some point, it was the 400th anniversary, a dark anniversary, of the beginning of North American African slavery. Okay, but this author's point is that there's more to Black history than just talking about slavery. And so that's, so she says one thing she likes to teach is Reconstruction. Let me finish out the introduction here. So she says Reconstruction refers to the period of time after the Civil War ended in 1865. Slavery ended and Black Americans gained political power, but they faced violence. Oh, so this is probably our thesis, right? This sounds more like a thesis. They gained political power, but they faced violence from white supremacists because of their race. Like many other writers, historians, and scholars, I am concerned about the lack of information students learn about Reconstruction in school. Here are some suggestions for educators and others interested in learning more about that time period. So this is an article. I found it online. I found it on a kind of a social studies teacher's website. And so this is probably a letter to teachers, right? But anybody interested in the time period. So we're going to hear some good information, and it might be in the form of tips to teachers, suggestions on how teachers can, in this author's view, better teach this portion of history. Okay. Jasmine, why don't you read paragraphs 5 and 6, if you would?
Sure. As most students do learn, the U.S. gained 3 constitutional amendments during Reconstruction. These changes to the Constitution granted civil and political rights to the Black Americans who had just been freed from slavery. In 1865, the 13th Amendment banned slavery, except when slavery is used as punishment for a crime. 14th Amendment was passed in 1868. The amendment said that all people born in the United States are U.S. citizens, and it also gave citizenship to all former slaves. On February 3rd, 1870, the 15th Amendment was passed. This law gave all male citizens the right to vote, regardless of race.
Okay, thank you. I think I misspoke. I think I may have said that only men became citizens, but that's not true. Excuse me. Um, so it says all people born in the United States are U.S. citizens, men, women, child. But it is the right to vote that only goes to male citizens, regardless of race, and that's the 15th Amendment. Jasmine, read paragraph 7 too, if you would.
Sure. The year 2020 marks the 150th year. The year 2020 marks the 150th anniversary of the 15th Amendment. The anniversary is a good opportunity to learn about how the amendment guaranteed voting rights to all men, no matter their race or if they used to be enslaved.
Okay, thank you. So that's a good overview of those three Reconstruction amendments. 13th, 14th, 15th Amendment. Carla, do you have a microphone? Could you read paragraph
Yeah.
8 and 9, if you would?
Okay. Let me zoom in here. I'm on my phone.
Oh, okay.
Okay. Black men use their new voting right to gain representation in government. However, social studies classes don't fully explore this part of Reconstruction. Hiram Rhodes Revels became the first African American senator in 1870. During Reconstruction, 15 other black men served in Congress, and a total of 2,000 black men held some type of public office. White supremacist groups like the Ku Klux Klan also formed after the Civil War. These terrorist groups engaged in violent racist acts to intimidate black American voters and lawmakers. This makes the accomplishments of African American politicians even more impressive. They had to do their job while being constantly threatened with racist violence.
Okay, so this is another thing you could study, and people do study at this time period, is the birth of the Ku Klux Klan, the KKK. And there were other groups, but of course that's the most famous today, and really I think it was kind of the most prominent then. So what do you think, not to make excuses for anybody by any means, but what do you think the white people who were terrorists, really, they were terrorists, what do you think they were so afraid of? Why? I mean, certainly there's racism, okay? The belief that people different than you are lesser than you. But what were they afraid of? What do you think they were concerned about?
Losing authority?
Losing authority,
But
okay?
probably not just that, but because probably they were afraid former slavers can like, give them back how they treated them.
Yeah, maybe seek revenge somehow. Yeah.
Um, I know they felt that they were criminals and so forth.
Who felt that? What do you mean?
Like the supremacists, they looked at them in a very negative light. Um, so just about every negative thing you could put out there, they thought that they were capable of.
Yeah, yeah. Well, yeah, you certainly have just straight up racism. And yeah, they're concerned. They have elections, okay, and everybody can vote now. Whereas before the Civil War, on voting day, it's all the white men going to vote. Well, now after the Civil War, you have all the white men and all the black men going to vote, and I think the black men voted. Today if you get 50% voter participation, you're doing pretty good. Voter participation after the Civil War, especially among the black population, was very high. You better believe these people were excited to vote, right? So they're going, and across the South, you have black people winning elections. You have one go to the Senate. You've got 15 others going to the House of Representatives, and 2,000 black men held some type of office, public office in the South. So black people are winning elections. The concern, if you're of a certain mind, the concern is, well, boy, I bet these former slaves are going to be angry, and they're going to, if I'm a white man, they're going to take it out on me. Or if I used to be a slave owner, are they going to put me in jail? How am I going to be treated? I used to be on top. Now I'm not. I used to have quite a lot of power and authority in my little world. Now I don't. And so they're concerned for themselves. What's going to happen? The world changed very much, very rapidly. And that freaks people out. Now, you could study how Abraham Lincoln, before he was assassinated, right at the very end of the Civil War, you could talk about how he had the attitude of, and some people didn't like this about him, but he really had a forgive and forget sort of attitude towards the South. He said, we're not going to punish the slave owners. We're not even going to punish the Confederate soldiers, the people who raised a gun and fought against the United States of America. We're not going to punish the Confederate soldiers, because Lincoln, and some people said this was the wrong attitude, but Lincoln said, "Hey, no, we're looking forward. We're moving on. We have to become one country again. And if we start punishing people, I mean, it'll just go round and round and round, right?" So Lincoln said, "We're just gonna forget it and move on, and not punish people." Now, certainly there's laws, and when the Ku Klux Klan arrives, Lincoln wasn't around then, but the federal government didn't like that and didn't support it. But yeah, you have a certain portion of white men across the South, white people across the South, they feel very threatened, and so they turn to violence and all kinds of violence, to intimidate. It's there quite often, even today, terrorists in general, they're not generally trying to punish people. They're trying to control behavior, right? So whether it's the Ku Klux Klan 150 years ago or other types of terrorists today, yeah, some of them are just crazy, and well, they're all crazy, but they just want to kill people. But back then, especially, they didn't, sure, they wanted to kill people, but they wanted to change behavior. They wanted to intimidate Black Americans, voters, and lawmakers. If you're a black senator or a white senator, and you're afraid, well, boy, if I make this decision or make this law, and if it angers some people, I may get killed, or my family may be in danger. That's going to change your behavior. So that was their goal, to intimidate, especially voters, lawmakers, to keep things the way they were, because they felt threatened. Nadia, could you read paragraphs 10 and 11?
Yes, Black American women technically gained the right to vote in 1920. In reality, many states still had discriminatory laws that limited their ability to vote. Many Black women were leaders in their movement for women's voting rights, also called women's suffrage. They spoke out about the issue and made organizations to fight for equal rights for all. One of the Black women activists during Reconstruction was Mary Ann Shedd Carey. She was the first Black woman in North America to edit and publish a newspaper, and one of the first Black female lawyers in the country. The journalist and civil rights activist Ida Wells
Ida.
was another woman. Ida
Ida, yeah.
was another woman of color who played a key role in the suffrage movement. She raised awareness of the horrible violence being committed against Black Americans.
Okay, thank you. So this gives us some specific individuals. Mary Ann Shedd Carey was, during the Reconstruction, was the first Black woman in North America, which I guess includes Canada. I don't know. I don't know why they make the distinction of that. To edit and publish a newspaper, and one of the first Black lawyers in the country. Ida B. Wells played a key role in the suffrage movement, women's suffrage movement, the women trying to get the right to vote. She raised awareness of the horrible violence being committed against Black Americans. Even then, you do have women and women and men. You have people arguing that women should have the right to vote, even then. But they chose specifically not to tackle that issue. And that was, in some ways, on purpose. They said, hey, we got to get, it's better to get something than nothing, is quite often an attitude in history, right? It's better to get something than nothing. And so they said, well, if we push for women's rights to vote, as well as civil rights for all black people, or even just the 15th Amendment. If we're pushing for the 15th Amendment, there's too much change too fast. Is not going to happen. So they said, well, let's set aside the question of women's voting and let's just focus on race, voting men voting regardless of race. So that was how they decided to do it. They didn't want to endanger the project of voting by asking for too much. So they, leaders and people said, well, let's give Black men the right to vote as citizens, but not women. That's too much. Not gonna pass. Society's not ready for it. So they have to wait till 1920 before you get, I think, the 20th Amendment that gives women the right to vote. But with the women's suffrage movement, you think, oh well, it must have been around 1920 because that's when it happened. But it was even at Civil War time, Reconstruction time, there was women arguing for women's suffrage. Okay. And so here, we highlight a few famous, or should be famous, Black women who played roles in those things. Let me see here. Toto Lope, could you read? Go ahead and read paragraph 12 and 13. They're long, but I'd appreciate that.
Okay. Before the Civil War, people who were enslaved could not legally get an education, and many states made teaching enslaved individuals to read a crime. When slavery ended, many Black Americans focused on education. In the North, several mostly white organizations helped create new educational opportunities for Black Americans. One of these organizations was the U.S. Bureau of Refugees, Freemen, and Abandoned Lands, better known as the Freedmen's Bureau. The Freedmen's Bureau was a government agency that helped Black Americans after the Civil War. The African American public schools established after the Civil War were mostly built and staffed by the Black community. Many universities opened during the Reconstruction. Today, these universities are called historical Black colleges and universities, or HBCUs.
These schools train Black people for careers as teachers, doctors, nurses, and other occupations. Today, many of the HBCUs are still open, including Howard University in Washington, D.C.
Yeah.
and Morehouse College in Georgia. Even now, HBCUs train more Black doctors and professionals than many other universities.
Okay, thank you. And sometimes in the news, if you pay attention to Washington, D.C., you hear people talking about HBCUs, historically Black colleges and universities. So during, as you say, during the Civil War, before the Civil War, it was illegal to teach a Black person to read. Certainly illegal to teach slaves, also illegal in many states to teach freed African Americans to read. It was illegal to teach them to read, to give them an education. Now, after the Civil War, during Reconstruction, they're now all free and civil citizens, and so they need an education. So you have a big boom at every level of education, of building schools, filling schools, built for African Americans. Now, it'd be interesting to trace the history that gets you from building schools for African Americans, okay, the recently freed slaves. 100 years later, you've got the Little Rock Nine, and they're trying to eliminate that idea of separate, segregated schools. So that's an interesting two moments in history to compare. One moment, you're building schools that are going to be separate, and then 100 years later, you're trying to undo that. But you know, that's the way the story unfolded. The Freedmen's Bureau was big during the Reconstruction period. The Freedmen's Bureau was a department in the federal government that was specifically created to help this transition of people who were, just a minute ago, they were all slaves with no rights and no property, and now they all needed jobs, they needed land, they needed education, they needed to, to integrate into society. So the Freedmen's Bureau was created, and it had its problems. It wasn't perfect. There was moments of corruption, but it was the department in the government that was designed to facilitate that transition, that blending back into society. A limited freedom. Okay, I'll finish this out here. So really, we're zooming over helicopter style quite a lot of different topics, but it gives us a good little overview of Reconstruction. It says the famous Black thinker W.E.B. Du Bois once explained how racist laws and violence in many states limited the freedom of Black Americans. And this is kind of the history of the Reconstruction in one sentence. The slave went free, stood for a brief moment in the sun, then moved back again towards slavery, he explained. This was not by choice. Many white supremacists were intimidated by the idea of Black Americans getting the right to vote and becoming successful. These white supremacists tried to gain power over Black Americans by using violence and creating unfair laws. Still, African Americans continued using their civil and constitutional rights to work as activists, politicians, business owners, teachers, and farmers. Today, racist violence has returned, and I would say it never went anywhere, and there have recently been cases where people of color have been kept from voting. Du Bois's words seem to ring true. At the same time, it's reassuring to remember how quickly formerly enslaved Black Americans got an education and became lawmakers. So yes, I find it very interesting period of time to study because of such immense change so very rapidly. And then it did it did much of it was undone in society because of the Ku Klux Klan and people who wanted to undo a lot of progress. Um, but so that's kind of an overview, lots of different topics. Um, I didn't get a chance to write any questions, so let me kind of scroll down through. What are our thoughts? Do you have any ideas? Anything on your mind as we read this?
No, I feel like it's pretty much uh overview of it's kind of an overview of a lot of the things that we have kind of gone over briefly, and it gives a pretty good outline for a study guide.
Yeah, yeah. Or, things if you wanted to read a little bit more, there's a lot of topics in here you could Google and search for. A lot of historians view this topic, slavery and the experience of Black Americans, as kind of the thread and really even foundation of our country's story. If you're telling the story of America and not and slavery and then because it's not all slavery, it's been a long time since slavery. If the story of African Americans in society isn't a central feature of you telling the American story, I would argue you're not doing a very good job. Um, you, you don't need to dwell on the bad things, and I would say it's a very bad thing. Slavery is a very bad thing, but you can't ignore it. And other countries don't necessarily have that story. Although, you know, like Nadia, we've asked you about race issues and ethnic arguing in in Europe and the Ukraine, and he said, well, there's really not because there's not a lot of people of African descent in Europe. Now there's some, but
But actually,
not as much as
actually,
here.
we didn't have slavery this way like people had here, but some kind of slavery took place in Russia too, long time ago. It was in the countries, so not in the big cities, but all people, all farmers did not belong to themselves.
Right.
They belonged to the some kind of like a slave owner, but they did not call it like slavery. It got different name in Russian. I can't translate it. But people could not move from one uh, country to another one. They belong to someone, to some owners too.
Yeah, I think
And it was not black woman, it was white. It was Russian people too.
right. Um, yeah, I mean there is I think in European history there's a lot of like what you might call feudal, like a feudal society where there's peasants and landowners, and if you're a peasant, your kids are probably going to, if you're a farmer, your kids are probably going to be a farmer and their kids are probably going to be a farmer, and you're not, and you're definitely on the bottom of society. Yeah. But this type of, and there's been slavery. I mean, there's slavery in the Bible. There's slavery throughout history. Even the Native Americans before Europeans arrived in the Americas, the Native Americans had their own slavery. But in most instances in ancient history, slavery is like if you're a slave, it's because your people lost a war, right? This type of slavery with capturing people in Africa, bringing them over, and then they are slaves the rest of their lives, and their children are slaves, and their children are slaves. That's a different kind of slavery. Let me type a word into the chat. It's called chat. Can I spell it? Um, it's called chattel slavery.
So they actually kidnapped people.
Yeah,
right?
it was a business. They would people slavers, you'd call them slavers, would show up in Africa and either capture, go out into Africa, Western Africa on the Atlantic Ocean side and capture people, take them to the Americas on their ships, or you had sometimes warring kingdoms, warring people, fighting people in Africa who would capture each other. And then one group of people in Africa would sell slaves that they've captured to the European slavers in Africa. So you did have some people, Africans capturing Africans. But one way or the other, they would capture them, they would get them, and then bring them to the Americas and sell them as property. That's a different type of slavery than the world had really ever seen before. And so historians call it chattel slavery. I typed it into the chat there. Chattel slavery, which has the same root word as the word cattle or cows, and it really means like these people were treated like animals, treated like cows, treated like livestock. They were property. No matter what they did or how long they lived, they would never get out of slavery. Um, that was basically a new invention at that time, as I understand it. Um, the idea that you're a slave because of where you're from, because of your skin color, and you will always be a slave. And if you have children, they're going to be slaves the moment they're born. That was a new thing. That was a new invention. I would say a terrible invention. Um, and so that idea is central to American history. Now it's not totally unique though, because those ships coming, those European ships carrying African slaves that they were going to sell. Let me see if I can find something. I'm thinking of a picture I've seen before. Let me see. Not all, oh, here we go. The transatlantic slave trade. Let me see if I can get this picture, this image. We think of it as a uniquely American thing, but it wasn't. Um, slaves went, a lot of slaves were captured in Africa and brought to, I don't think it's going to work, were brought to North America. But the majority of slaves actually went to South America. So you can see um, this map that I have here, and the lines are thicker, right? Really only like 5% of slaves captured in Africa came to North America, came to what was, well, then was the United States. A lot went to the Caribbean, a lot went to Brazil. Now I've taught a student, a high school guy before, from Brazil, and he's very smart, and he's a really great guy. And I've talked to him a lot about Brazilian history. There's a lot of slavery in Brazilian history. Um, and it actually mirrors American history quite a bit. It's really interesting. Um, but I mean, look on this map. The thickest line goes to Brazil and other South American countries, but straight into Brazil. There was a lot, just like there was slavery here, and it's a central part of our history. There's a lot of African history or African slavery going on in Brazil at this time. Now, I think they ended it without a civil war, and that's a whole other history that's interesting to study, how Brazil ended their history of slavery. But we're not, you see this map here, we're not the only ones buying those African slaves. Go into the Caribbean, go in here, and you also see them go in other directions into the Arabian Peninsula, the North Africans. North Africans were buying other Africans as slaves as well. So it's a larger history than just the United States. We were not the only people getting those African slaves. Um, if you look at the thinness of the line going up into this corner into America, we were getting, I think I've seen 5% of the slaves that were being sold around the world. Um, so anyway, I think that's an interesting thing to think about. It wasn't just a unique American problem. We handled it in our own unique way. Every country is going to end that story somehow, and we ended ours with a war. And um, well, anyway, there you go. So any other questions?
Can I make a comment?
Yeah, please.
So I'm Salvadorian by birth,
Okay.
and I kind of grew up here, but I was adopted. But anyways, I think El Salvador was one of the few countries that didn't get any slaves.
Oh, really?
Yes, because well, part of it was because we are a mixture of European and Native American, but they're called indigenous over there. You know, they're indigenous to the country. And so the president, since the blood of the indigenous had already been mixed with European, Spanish, Portuguese, French, you know, the president at that time didn't want any more mixture into the blood also. And he knew also that if he take African Americans, there will be more in it. And he didn't believe in enslaving people. So he didn't get any. And that's one of the few countries that don't have. So we don't have that history.
Oh, wow. I didn't know that. So
Yeah, we don't have that history.
so did
Uh-huh.
he not, the president at the time didn't want, so maybe this is simplifying it too much, but would you say that the president blocking slavery, which is a good thing,
Uh-huh.
did he do it for bad reasons because he didn't want Africans mixing into the society? Like you said, mixing their blood, you know?
You know, I'm not sure about that. I think that he wanted to preserve the little bit of indigenous blood that we still had because
Yeah, okay.
when the Spanish took over our country, I don't know how many years that was. That's why we have lost the language. Now we speak Spanish and we're called Latinos. But before that, we were indigenous and we had our own language. And I mean, there's still some in the dialect. Like my grandmother is full-blooded, almost, and she still has a lot of words mixed in with her Spanish and everything. But I think he still wanted to keep some of that culture in there. And he
Uh,
thought, well, the Spanish came and they took the culture, they took the language, and we fought. You know, I don't know if he just didn't want another change into the country.
yeah. No, it's interesting to try to preserve the native um, culture and people. Yeah, it's interesting. I didn't know that.
I have to do some more research because yeah, I don't know exactly everything, but I should read more into it.
Yeah, huh. Yeah, it's interesting because, I'm born and lived in America all my life, and you don't think, I think most people, um, you're so focused on your own country and you don't think every country, even tiny little El Salvador, not very big, has its own story, has its own country, has made its own decisions, has its own government, and it has been writing its own story all these years. Um, and in the Americas, we have, North and South America, Central America, we have a common history of, there was native people here for thousands of years, and then the Europeans came, and every country dealt with that a little bit differently, and then African slaves were brought over. Every country deals with that a little bit differently. So there is one larger story that's common, but every country and even parts of countries are going to have their own unique bits of that. Yeah. So no, that's interesting. Thank you for sharing.
Yes, because you're welcome. Because a little higher of El Salvador, Honduras. I have several friends from there, and they're descendants from slaves. And
Huh.
then also Belize up there, they also have, and Costa Rica, like I think Nicaragua too. So there's only, I don't know if Guatemala has any, but I know El Salvador. So there's not very many that didn't, you know.
Yeah. That's really interesting.
Thank you.
Okay. Any other questions? Anything to talk about?
No, thank you.
Okay. Well,
No,
super.
thank you.
Yeah, I'll send this out. I'll send out the email later this afternoon, as always. We are now statewide on a stay-at-home order, so I hope everybody's well and keeping busy, keeping positive somehow, and stay safe. And I'll talk to you next week then.
Thank
Thank you,
you.
you
Have a
too.
great
Thank
week.
you.
All right. Have a
Thank
Bye.
good
you.
day.
Look, bye.
Bye,
Bye.
everybody.
Thank you.